Recently, I've been working on a series of projects to interface HDMI devices, both sources and sinks, to other video standards. Standards like the Composite 3 RCA jacks, with the yellow being the video, to things like Component with the RGB, VGA, as well as switching between different HDMI devices and testing HDMI cables and HDMI signals. So I put together a series of videos of what I have learned, kind of my experience of what worked and what didn't. And I hope they might be useful if you're involved in some of this kind of thing, whether you're trying to convert HDMI to one of these older formats, or whether you're trying to convert one of these older formats to HDMI, or you're just testing or switching HDMI itself. I'm going to be talking about a number of video interfacing techniques, the kind of the history, and a little bit about the technology and so on. The reason what I'm showing on this screen here is a test pattern that's coming from this Sencor generator. And let me turn the volume or the audio off. The output of that generator is coming through this device, which is a video or AV to HDMI converter. And I started with this because this sort of represents the beginning and the present. On the right over here is sort of the way things were in the 70s, and on the left here is the way things are here in the 21st century. And so what I'm going to be doing is talking about some of the differences between these kinds of connections and the HDMI connections, and then also a number of things having to do with converting from one to the other in both directions, splitting them, advantages, disadvantages. I'm going to be trying to keep the video short, so I may have to make more than one to get all of that material in. So bear with me if I seem to be going either too fast or too slow. I'm going to try to cover things people might want to know, but at the same time, I may be skipping kind of quickly over some stuff if you haven't seen it before. So why all of this? Well, the reason, I think, is you can get some idea on the back of this unit. This is a DVD player. And you see that on the back here you have an HDMI, some what are called RCA jacks, and they have, on the far right there, you see a red and a white. Those are for what are called analog audio. In the middle is a digital coaxial. That is for audio, but in digital form. And then on the left, you see in the top left, the yellow connector is the normal video out. It's also called Composite. And then around it, the green, the red, and the blue are what are called component outputs. And these are sort of the evolution of how you connect things like VCRs, which are of course now obsolete, DVD players, which are quickly becoming obsolete, and other devices to your display or your television set. It began with that little yellow connector, and then they added stereo audio with the red and white on the far right when VCRs first came out, and it enabled you to make a better connection between these devices and your TV. So let's talk about kind of the evolution of this, but before I do that, let me talk about why HDMI is different from all of these things on the right. All the things on the right, with the exception of the coaxial digital audio, the black connector, those are all analog signals. So whether it was the low definition yellow signal, the composite, or whether it was the red, green, blue component video, those are all analog, as well as the audio being analog. What happened with HDMI is they went to digital, and in fact that's where the D in HDMI comes from, is well, actually it's high definition or high definition digital, depending on how you read that media interface. So what's the difference? Well, the easiest way to see the difference is to look at this diagram, which is kind of the interconnection between two HDMI devices. You notice on the left you have an HDMI source. Sometimes that's called the transmitter. On the right you have an HDMI sink. Sometimes that's called the receiver. But the difference is that even though there are signals that go from the transmitter to the receiver that go in one direction, that is this way, there also are some signals down here at the bottom that come back. And those are the what's called the display data channel. In other words, for the first time with HDMI, the receiver could talk back to the transmitter. And that allows some advantages. For example, the transmitter can adjust itself to, say, the resolution of the receiver, but it also allows things like copy protection. So, for example, if you have this plugged into a device that does not have copy protection, the transmitter can say, I'm sorry, I won't send you the data because you won't protect it properly. And that was one of the changes that the movie industry insisted on when HDMI was brought out. So now let's switch and start talking about how you convert between all these various formats. Okay, as we talked about a second ago, this device connects from what's called AV or composite video with analog audio, converts it to HDMI. If you have a really old player or a real old source of audio and video, this is probably what you need. This particular device I bought from, I think, eTech City, and this is the box it came in. Get connected. Let's see, it's called an HDVM615 is the model number. So if you're looking for one of these, of course I don't have any connection with either the seller or the maker of this. It's just one that I found that works. Another thing that I found that works is this device, which is made by a company called Stellar Labs, which I think is a brand that is owned by MCM Electronics. At least they tend to sell it quite a bit, and that's where I got this one. This, as you notice, converts from a component video, that is the RGB signals. It also has optical inputs. Notice on the left is Toslink and on the right is coaxial. We'll talk a little more about that in a second. And then on the other side is HDMI. This device works pretty well. So if you have a component source like a high definition box of some kind, even a regular DVD player that has 480p, which is progressive instead of interlaced, then you probably need one of these devices if you need to connect to a new HDMI device. So those are sort of the ways of converting between the two. Now, I mentioned that digital audio and analog audio, that is the red and white there. When digital audio first came out, it was developed by Philips, and they used the thing on the left called a Toslink, which is a digital interface. By the way, that's what the DIF and SPDIF stands for is digital interface, and it's basically a way of conveying high resolution audio from one place to another. So you see there's a Toslink input and a coaxial input. So if that's what you have, then this is the kind of device you need. I forgot to mention, by the way, that the model number on this Stellar Labs component to HDMI converters is 3311600. I also forgot to mention that they do make these with conventional audio, that is analog audio inputs. In other words, it would have the RGB on one side, and then it would have the red and white audio in place of the digital audio on the right. Also, out of completeness, I suppose I should mention that if you have a real old TV that doesn't have any input except just the antenna connection, you can still buy these video converters that will connect basically the old AV and analog audio and convert it to an RF signal that you can then connect to your TV set. In fact, the early days of VCRs, most of them started out, this was the connection mechanism. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that it has much lower definition and more subject to interference and so on. So basically, the progression was from the old modulators, channel 3 and 4 kind of thing, to AV or composite, a little better definition, less interference, then to component video, which is the first high-definition video interface, and then eventually to HDMI, which is both a high-definition video and high-definition audio. So, now let's talk about going the other way. Okay, suppose that what you want to do is you want to go the other way. That is, you want to go from an HDMI signal to a composite with audio. Well, that's what this device will do, and I have a number of these. I've bought them from a couple of different sources. The ones that are configured like this all have worked. I think I have 5 of them hooked up to different TVs. These 2, of course, are spares right now. And they basically are called a mini TV system converter or an HDMI to AV. The first of these that I got from MCM Electronics worked fine. Then I found a couple more from I think an Amazon supplier, and then I wound up ordering 2 more from that same supplier. Those all seemed to work fine. However, I ordered some from a Chinese supplier, and they appeared to be exactly the same thing, HDMI to AV mini. The difference is that if you look at, let me take this one out so you can see it a little better. Sorry for the rustling. If you look at the connections, they are the same colors, but they're in a different order. Okay, this is the mini that doesn't work. This is the one that does. Notice that this one, if you turn it up this way, it reads correctly. CVSS and then left and right. The left is the white, the right is the red, and that one works. These, and I have a couple of them, in fact I have 4 of them, because when a first group didn't work, I told them, and they sent me 2 replacements. They didn't work either. They also have CVSS, but they have the red as being the left and the white as being the right. Now that in itself wouldn't be a problem, except that these on the bottom do not work. The ones on the top do. So if you're ordering, what I suggest is that you make sure that you have the ones that have the white in the center. That apparently is the batch that works, and for some reason there is a batch that's out there that have the red in the center, and those don't work. Another alternative for doing the same thing, that is converting from HDMI to composite, is this converter from Radio Shack. Now, it's a little bit more expensive. In fact, it's quite a bit more expensive than these here. And my experience is it works on most devices, but not on all. Apparently, it is self-powered, and something happens to the power on some devices. They don't supply enough power. And so, in my opinion, this one isn't as good as these, but it does work. So if you can't find one of these, or you don't want to take a chance that you're going to get the wrong kind, you may still be able to find some of these at Radio Shack. I realize they've gone bankrupt and a lot of the stores have closed, but nonetheless, this thing did work for me on a couple of DVD players, but not on all of them. Another thing you may want to do with an HDMI source is be able to connect it to a VGA monitor. These devices, you'll find, I think this one was cost me like $9 or $10 from a Chinese supplier. And you may need these if you're, for example, trying to connect a Raspberry Pi and you don't have an HDMI television to hook it to. All you have, say, is an old computer monitor that only has the VGA connector. These work pretty well too, although one problem that they have is sometimes, depending on how the VGA is set up, it may not do the conversion correctly. In other words, you need to make sure that you're using this on a monitor that's capable of adjusting itself, because this device doesn't adjust itself. It basically takes the HDMI signal, sends it out as a VGA signal in the same format, and if your monitor can't adapt to that, well, it won't work. But most monitors will, at least the modern monitors, are self-adapting. Another couple of things you might be interested in looking at. This is an HDMI splitter. It takes two HDMI inputs. I'm sorry, it takes one HDMI input and creates two HDMI signals. You might want this, for example, if you want to watch the same program on two different HDMI TVs, maybe in different rooms or in a classroom setting where you want to have one that's closer to the teacher and one closer to the students, or things of that sort. This device is an HDMI switcher, and basically what it does is it takes several HDMI inputs, in this case 3, and allows you to switch them to one output. So if you have a bunch of players and your TV is limited on the number of inputs, HDMI inputs, you might want one of these devices. It also has a couple of additional features, including a remote control and so on. Now, this box I got from MCM Electronics, and at the time I bought it, they were selling them for $39. And I think it's called, once again, this is Stellar Labs, model 3311960. And I forgot to tell you about this one, the HDMI splitter. I got this from Walmart, only online, but you can order it online from Walmart, pick it up at your Walmart store. For the price, this one seems to be the best splitter. It worked everywhere I've tried to use it. I have a couple of them. This is my spare, but I have a couple others in service on different units. It splits the signal and seems to preserve all of the quality of the HDMI in doing so. You might find yourself in a situation like I did at one point with some security cameras that output a PAL signal. PAL is the European standard, the old European standard for video, I think it stands for phased alternate line. At any rate, they won't work with an NTSC monitor, or in this case it was a security system that expected an NTSC signal. So I got some of these. They work fine. They convert. Once again, they are made by Mini, or at least that's the name on them. Once again, I think I got these from the same vendor that sold me these, which was an Amazon supplier. Not Amazon itself, I don't think. I should mention, by the way, that if you have one of these devices, you don't need one of these, because there's a switch on this that allows you to select between PAL and NTSC. So if you have a PAL source, an HDMI PAL source, or I'm sorry, if you have an HDMI source and you want it to output to a PAL TV, that is the European standard, well then all you have to do is switch that switch. And the last thing I'll mention is that this little USB power cable, on some devices you need to plug that in. It hooks between a USB port and this power connector. But on most devices, this unit will power itself completely off of the HDMI. It's one of the advantages of this, and I think having that power jack is one of the advantages here, because the Radio Shack doesn't have that. And because of that, when you run into problems like I did on a couple of units that don't supply enough power, you can fix that by simply plugging in a USB power supply and a cable. This is an HDMI signal tester. The distinction is this is the only tester that you plug in to a working HDMI powered up system. In other words, what I have here is on one side I have the signal coming from this converter. The converter is being driven by my Sencore signal generator, and one reason is it gives me a number of different test patterns, including things like audio and other things to test. So it allows me to kind of ring out systems. This used to be used for the old television sets, and was intended more for the old analog TVs. But with this converter that you may have seen in a previous video, you can convert its signals to HDMI and then use it to test HDMI TVs. Now, if you also saw the previous video, you know this converter puts out an HDMI signal. I forgot to mention, it'll do that either in 720p or in 1080p. So it'll even test the very high definition sets. Of course, this generator doesn't put out a high definition signal, so even though it's 1080p, it's what some people would call up-converted. The reason that I point out that this is a signal tester, not a cable tester, is although it will allow you to test cables, you have to use it on a working system. There are a number of cable testers, and I'll show you one of these in a minute. Never plug one of these cable testers into a working unit. They're not intended to monitor the HDMI signals. They are only intended to test cables. And so you notice this one says cable tester. This one says signal tester. I don't really remember where I got this, but it's a let's see if it has a manufacturer's name on it anywhere. I don't see it. But at any rate, you may notice on here that it shows a number of signals, including, if you remember my introduction, there are signals that are used for basically the video, which are the signals on top. The RXC, RX2, that's the clock and data, and RX1 and RX0. The RXC is the clock. RX0, 1, and 2 are the digital data signals. And then down below you see you have a CK, which is a clock, a DA, which is data, an HPD, which is whether or not it's running in high speed, and the 5-volt power symbols. So basically this, and there also is a CEC, which stands for cyclic error check, or used to be called cyclic redundancy check. You may see it as CRC on some units, but CEC is basically the check. And on some signals, you use that to do error checking. So that's the way you test signals. Now let me show you what happens when I remove the video signal. You'll notice that it continues to put out signals, and the reason is that even though it's no longer sending an HDMI signal, the tester thinks that it's still getting all the right voltages and so on. But watch what happens when I turn off the power. You'll notice that the bottom row of lights went out completely. Now the reason that the RX signals are still there is because it's still connected up here through a cable and through this switch box to this TV. And the TV is supplying those signals. I'm going to switch it now so that it works off of my computer. And there you'll see computer. Now if you notice, those signals have disappeared because they're on the downside of that switch. And by the way, I didn't mention this switch. These are also available. I'll try to get that LED from shining in your face there. This is a passive switch. I showed you a switch that's an active switch that I think is made by Stellar Labs, a 3x1. This is a 2x1 passive switch, and the difference is that it does not amplify the signals, it just passes them through. Okay, so we're going to plug this back in, and you see the power lights come back on, but you notice the data, which is basically the handshake between the two units, has gone off. Now I'm going to switch up here, and as I do, I'm going to let you watch kind of both. Well, I can't do that easily, but let's watch down here. You notice that as soon as those lights came on, then we got our HDMI signal up here. So this is the kind of unit you use if you think that either your sender or your receiver, in other words your DVD player or your TV, isn't working. If on the other hand you think that the problem is in the cabling, well, although you can use this to test cables by using a known good cable and then substituting the suspect cable and so on, the easier way is to use one of these. So let's switch to cable testing here in a moment. And once again, let me emphasize, while you can use a signal tester to test cables, you cannot use a cable tester to test signals. Okay, let's talk about testing HDMI cables. Now, I've had no failed HDMI cables out of perhaps 100 or so that I have used or installed or tested over the last couple of years. I have never found a bad one, but there are potential problems, the connections in here as well as broken wires and other things. But understand that a cable tester like this does not actually test the cable under the high definition protocol. In other words, it basically just tests whether the wires connect from the proper pins here to the proper pins over here. So let's do that, and then let's talk about what you can and can't do with these testers. This is the cable that I was using a little bit ago to work on that signal tester over there, and let me emphasize again, signal tester you can use on the signals, a powered up device. The cable tester is not connected to a powered up device. In fact, let me show you that this is just a cable going from one side to the other. It's not connected to any sources of power except the tester itself. So let's plug it in. And you notice that all the lights came on. By the way, this cable tester is made or sold by Monoprice. It wasn't very expensive. And they can be very, very useful, especially if you're having to check a bunch of HDMI cables to make sure they're good. If you're hooking up a bunch of stuff in a cramped location, the one thing you don't want to have to do is to be swapping cables back and forth after you're back there. You want to go in with every one of your cables known good. And so that's one reason that these are useful. If you had a problem, you could of course use it to troubleshoot. But once again, let me point out that while on the instruction manual it says cable tester, on the unit itself it does not say cable tester. It just says HDMI tester. Don't confuse this with a signal tester that actually is meant to be hooked up to a powered circuit. Well, let's now look at an alternative to this one that I think is actually a little bit lower in price, but they basically do the same thing. By the way, you may have noticed when I plugged this in, it immediately powered up, tested the cable, and displayed the results on this string of LEDs. The next one works a little bit differently. It accomplishes the same purpose. That's this one. It's made by Pyle, and it's called a PHC T85. And it basically is the same thing, although here the two pieces are detached. By the way, you can detach on this one, you can detach one end so that you can put, if you have a long run, you can put this at one end and put this at the other end to test cables from a remote location. Same thing is true of this one. The difference is this one doesn't have a way of hooking the two back together again like this one does, which can be convenient in making sure you don't lose it on a job or whatever. So now let's look at this one. I've hooked up the HDMI cable to this tester, and right now I've left the remote out of the picture. Unlike this HDMI tester or cable tester here, this one has an on-off switch. When you turn it on, it performs a test. And you see it indicates that all of the lines are working. Now, the difference is this unit is actually doing a dynamic test. That is, it's actually changing signals on each of those wires and making sure that they come through independently. This one, as far as I can tell, just uses a DC signal. And so I think this one will do a little bit better job of testing the cable, although I don't really think that either of them claim that they will verify how high a speed your cable will work. So let's do another test. We still have it powered on. We push the test button, and you notice that it links each of the lines. It apparently, I don't know the schematic, so I don't know, but apparently it's doing a dynamic test of each line. So now let's suppose that, and of course this works real well when you're testing a cable locally. Let's suppose you need to test one remotely, and as you noticed on that one, you can do that by detaching the unit on the right. On this one, you have a detached unit that's all ready, so let's plug that in and see what happens. Now I've plugged the remote end of this cable into the remote part of this tester, and now we'll power it up, and you notice it does the same thing, and it also indicates it on the remote end, which, by the way, that one does the same thing. The reason that you want that is you might have somebody working at this end who presses the test button, but you might not have communication to the remote end, and the remote end, by seeing this, when the person at this end pushes it, you see right away that it's working. So that is the pile device, and I guess if I were going to give a recommendation, I would say both of them will seem to work fine, but if I'm right that this one does it under dynamic conditions, then you might prefer this one just because it puts the cable under a little bit more of a test condition. So that's the PHC T85 made by Pile, and I don't remember what I paid for these, but that wouldn't really matter anyway because the prices change all the time on the internet. So if you want to get a cable tester, I suggest both of these seem to work fine for me, and it's kind of your choice based on what you can get and what you want to pay. There are more expensive HDMI testers and cable testers that actually test everything dynamically, and they actually contain HDMI decoder chips and all that kind of stuff. They are hundreds of dollars. For the average person, even someone doing some audio-video work, I don't think you need all of that. But if you've got the money to spend and you want one that really wrings these cables out, then you might go up to one of those very expensive dynamic testers. So I hope this has all been useful to you, and if I get some questions, I may do a supplementary video at some point on some of these things, but I'm intending to kind of be complete without getting too technical about all of the details of how HDMI works and what the differences are between it and some of the earlier formats. An area related to HDMI is digital audio, or what some people call Toslink or SPDIF. This was a system that was invented to carry high-definition audio over an optical link. Later it was modified to carry the same information over a coaxial link. And what we have here are a couple of adapters that will adapt from optical to digital. This one, for example, has coaxial in, that is the RCA type coaxial connector, and an optical out. And plugged into the optical out is a little adapter. And the reason that it's there is this is the old style of Toslink. This is the new style right here. And you may notice that it's much smaller. The old style would fit in things like this switch. The way this switch works is you have a single connector here, which can either be the input or the output because it's an optical switch. And then you select, by rotating this, which of the other optical connections you make. And so this is a little bit like, it's fundamentally a fiber optic switch. The coaxial, which is this type of connector, it was a change that was added to allow basically an electrical connection of the same type. In other words, it uses the digital audio format, but it's conveyed over an electrical connection instead of an optical fiber connection. So if you need to convert from one to the other, you might want to get one of these adapters. This has the optical in, coax out. This one is the coaxial in, optical out. And you might need to get an adapter depending on which kind of box you have. The newer boxes tend to have these newer mini Toslink connectors. The older boxes tend to have this style of connector, and so This is, for example, an adapter that converts from the male of the new style to a male of the old style. And of course they make them to go in reverse, as this one is. This one goes from the male of the new style to a female of the old style. So I hope that helps if you're looking for hooking up a Toslink connection that often you get either out of an HDMI splitter, or, as you saw in one of the other videos in this series, sometimes when you're up-converting a component video system to HDMI, the audio is in the form of Toslink. So you may need some adapters or some switches or other things to convert or configure your system. So I hope this helps a little bit in what the various audio digital options are, and is intended as a kind of supplement to the HDMI videos. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to go on and add a little bit at the end of this one on an amplifier that I built to help, because sometimes when you take signals off an HDMI, the audio levels will drop significantly, so you may need to boost them up a little bit, but we'll talk about that in the next segment. What I have here is a stereo amplifier that's designed to boost line level signals. I discovered when I was working with some of the HDMI to composite video that the line levels of the audio were quite a bit lower, and so I built this to boost those up. It's built from a design, actually a little kit that's sold by Nightfire Electronics. There you can see the web address, vakits.com, and this is the one based on a pair of LM386s. This is basically the schematic, and as you can see, they're identical, one for the left channel, one for the right channel. I put it in a small aluminum utility box and added a power supply. This is one of those little switching mode power supplies that puts out, I think this is a 9-volt supply. This is 1,000 milliamps. You don't, of course, need that much current. But at any rate, this is a answer to the problem of low line levels. If you are trying to convert HDMI to composite, the audio will tend to come out, at least in my experience, a lot lower than it was on the HDMI signal. So this helps to boost it back up and you get it back to the normal level.